Welcome, everyone. As we wait for more folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. I'm Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Talks at Pulitzer with photographer Brian Frank, a Pulitzer Center grantee, Norris Henderson, founder of Voice of the Experience and Voters Organized to Educate, and Helena Huang, project director of the Art for Justice Fund. We're very glad to have you. I see we have folks joining us from Jackson, Mississippi, Brooklyn, New York City, and Dallas, Texas. So please keep letting us know where you're tuning in from. New Orleans, Fort Lauderdale, Lowell, Mass. This is terrific. This session is part of our summer series, Focus on Justice. We believe it is critical, especially at this time in history, to keep issues of justice at the forefront of our reporting and our conversations. Remember all those who suffer from race-based violence, and especially those killed this year, among them Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. For those of you who have not joined us before, a bit of background. Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism education organization based in Washington, D.C. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. On our website, please take a look under our reporting issues page where we bring together this work by themes, including racial justice, indigenous communities, environment and climate change, and COVID-19. We have developed a strong university program connecting journalists with college campuses in person and now virtually to engage with students. And we also award reporting fellowships every year to students from our university partners, now more than 35. On the K through 12 education front, we reach thousands of students and educators via class visits, online sessions, and professional development workshops. And of course, there are public and university events and webinars, such as this one that you are attending today. You can find more at pulitzercenter.org. Now, a few logistics before we move on to our conversation with our speakers today. We're enthusiastic for you to participate via your questions. So please find on your screen the Q&A icon, and you can begin adding your questions at any time throughout these remarks. There's also a chat icon on your screen, and please use that for any specific technology issues. Note that all attendees are muted, but if you cannot hear us, please let us know via the chat. We are also recording this session to post it online for others who could not join us today. And if you would like to tweet, please use the hashtag #JusticeFocus. One final bit of logistics, there will be a brief survey at the end of our session, so please stay on to participate in that. Now I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Brian Frank is a photojournalist and Pulitzer Center grantee. In 2018, Brian launched a pilot workshop exploring visions of justice with court-involved youth at San Francisco State University, provoking a strong conversation about the ability of artistic outlets to support youth in the criminal justice system. Norris Henderson is the founder and executive director of the Voice of the Experienced, or VOTE, and Voters Organized to Educate. He works to impact public policy and discourse about reentry, police accountability, and public defense for marginalized communities. As someone who was wrongfully incarcerated for 27 years, he shares his firsthand experience of racism and brutality of the criminal justice system with communities of color throughout the country. Helen Wong is the project director of the Art for Justice Fund, a $100 million 5-year fund dedicated to ending mass incarceration in the United States through criminal justice grants in support of high-impact campaigns in the justice sector and the arts. I'd now like to turn this conversation over to our speakers. Thank you all.
Well, hello and good afternoon, everybody. Helena Huang with the Art for Justice Project. And first, many thanks to the Pulitzer Center, to Anne and to Holly and to John and everybody on your team for all your tireless efforts to keep independent journalism covering the pressing issues of our time. I am really excited to be here today, and thank you all at home for joining. It's really fun to see familiar names and faces. Appreciate members of the A4J team who are here. Appreciate your support. And I couldn't be more delighted than to be on this panel and having the pleasure to introduce two extraordinary champions for justice, Brian Frank and Norris Henderson. Both you will get to hear from very soon. I wanted to start perhaps with just a few framing remarks. And then, as you heard, we will have what I believe will be a very timely and robust conversation before opening up for questions and answers. But first, just to kind of put this conversation, activism and art in pursuit of transformational change, putting it in the context of today. And we were just all kind of talking about what the world has been like this past little while. And I don't need to remind anybody on this call what a historical moment of reckoning we really find ourselves in. And it's no wonder. In very short order, we have been living through a confluence of factors, not the least of which is 3.5 years of our current federal administration, which has been generating unprecedented inequality long before this global pandemic. It is now estimated that in our country, the average wealth, the wealth gap between a Black household and a white household is $1 to 10 cents. Historic inequality. Add in a COVID-19, which is disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities and other essential workers, and some of our most vulnerable populations, which we know to be people in prison, in nursing homes, and meatpacking industries. All of this has generated economic crisis, which has left over 31 Americans unemployed. And we're not done. Add in high-profile killings, the murder of George Floyd, just to name a few, and mention some of the other names of individuals who were killed at the hands of law enforcement, all of which has created a connection and a through line from this history's legacy of chattel slavery to the criminalization of largely Black and brown men and people, to over-policing, to mass incarceration for the whole world to see. So we're in a moment where people are seeing things that perhaps we haven't always seen as fully as we're now seeing. Add in 8 weeks of sustained protest by multiracial coalitions, which we are really demanding for the first time perhaps in a generation, systemic reform to address this inequality and racial disparities, such that we are asking for reallocating resources from police and law enforcement, abolishing prisons, shrinking the footprint of our kind of punitive punishment culture and mentality, such that we'll have a chance to kind of liberate our imaginations and really begin to allocate resources to all the things that we all need in order to live healthy and full, vital lives. So all this is going on. Did I miss anything? I'm sure I've missed things, but all to say, even recounting what we've all just been through and are living through, it's pretty staggering. All of this pain, all of the consequence of this historic moment, I think, is what many of us have been working for. Certainly Brian and Norris have been working for decades now. And it is a kind of political and cultural opportunity that I think we are all eager to make the most of. And so it is in this context, ever-changing context, that we want to have this particular conversation about the role of activism and the role of art to transform and bring about the kind of world that we all want to live in. So with that, let me just say a little bit more before we dive right in. And that is, I first had the privilege of meeting Norris Henderson almost 20 years ago. And at that time, as mentioned in his bio, he was serving 27 years in prison in Angola State Penitentiary. He was already a respected leader on the inside, and I was a young program officer at the Open Society Foundations, back at a time when it was the height of tough on crime policy, and there were very few philanthropic institutions that were taking up the call to action. It was a very different day than we have today, although Norris, I'm sure, will say that there's lots of things that are still very much the same, and we will get to that. But all to say that what I saw at Angola was, and this wasn't my first prison that I had ever been to, but it certainly was my first maximum security prison in the South that was a former plantation. And I can tell you that what I saw in my 2 days of spending time there were correctional officers on mounted horseback overseeing prisoners who were bent over the fields picking soybeans and okra for 4 cents an hour. And it was all but impossible. It was all but impossible not to see the through line from this country's legacy of chattel slavery to what we now see as the modern day manifestation of over-policing, criminalization, and mass incarceration. So as you can imagine, those images, those stories, Norris, the people that I met, that has stayed with me all these years. And I think fueled in me and in many of us the desire to animate these stories, elevate, and to see the kind of mainstreaming of understanding has been quite gratifying in these last 20 years. But as you know, we still have much more to do. In the end, the project that I was there in Angola, and I had the privilege of working with Norris, was we put together a documentary on a very special program that was happening in Angola. Norris was one of the founders, and it was a hospice program. It was a hospice program where prisoners were trained and volunteered to care for other incarcerated people at the end of their lives. And it was a powerful film, but I think what I didn't fully appreciate until many years later, and I think it's part of what we want to talk about today, was the way in which that documentary began to do what's happening in a much more vibrant way today, and much more needs to happen, which was that we shifted the gaze and we told stories and we disrupted the narrative. Instead of hardened criminals, we were talking to men who were training to care and nurture with compassion others. And I think it's exactly those kinds of themes and the power of art, which I think we are seeing kind of helping to create these opportunities and these moments of reckoning and opening that we're experiencing right now. Norris will go on and he'll tell you that from his early work inside, just 2 years ago, he managed to help pass at the Louisiana State Legislature one of the most important piece of legislation around justice reinvestment. And I think that's another really good example, and I hope we'll have more time to talk about it, just the way in which the ideas, the creativity and brilliance of people inside when they're organizing for change, and the opportunities when people come home to really help lead this movement to end mass incarceration. So again, wanna say that, and also just wanna speak to the work that Brian has been doing these many, many years. And I think he has taken kind of those early lessons and just taken it to the next level, which is really embodying the notion that Brian Stevenson talks about around proximity. And that is, he is there inside with young men and children telling stories, helping people to tell their own stories. And he will speak to the way in which those experiences have helped him to find his own voice. And I think, again, this speaks to the kind of transformative power of art. It happens on an individual level when people are, are claiming their own agency. And then it's happening on the more macro level where we're working to change the narrative, disrupt really pernicious stereotypes and notions about humans, and open up a space so that we can really imagine, again, the world that we want to live in. So with that, I think I want to turn to Brian first. He's got a lot to say about his work and what it means, and I can tell you it is really, really powerful. We're gonna show a few pieces as well. But Brian, if maybe you could take a moment and just add or amend anything that I've said in terms of my attempt to try to set the stage, and then please share with us, your origin story, the work that you are doing, and perhaps a bit of specifically about how art has been a unique tool that you have used to help bring about individual and more macro change. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks for that nice intro. So I guess really kind of my journey down this road of really working, of really focusing on criminal justice work. Well, if you really go back, I mean, I'm formerly incarcerated myself, and kind of my experiences in that world, and of the ways in which I was policed differently than other young boys of my age shaped my whole view on society. Just want to start there. But when I really started focusing my journalism on criminal justice was when I was about to become a father, and I found myself on assignment in a juvenile facility just by sheer chance. And I was thinking a lot in that time about my experiences with authority and how that often was tinged by racism, coming from a mixed race family, and how I didn't want my boy to have to go through the same things that I went through. And then I find myself in this juvenile facility. The interesting thing about that was I was introduced to this facility as kind of as a inmate firefighter camp. And I think it's important to talk about branding here and what the state has done with that. We're talking about, the reason I was brought there was to kind of show, the state of California uses these inmate firefighters to do good in the community. But, really what we were talking about here is prison labor, right? And so as I kind of started to work with a lot of these kids, and they were kids, okay? This is the last, it was the last juvenile camp in the state where they had kids working as firefighters. I started to just kind of, it shook my whole worldview. And, the way that I wanted to approach it was like, I started kind of seeing myself in a lot of these guys, and it was a really powerful experience as an artist, and it was a real like awakening for me. And I mean, here, like at this image that we see here, this is actually after I worked in that facility. I started hearing the same stories about where these kids came from, and so I wanted to go back out into the communities where they came from and photograph that experience. And I mean, this image right here in particular was one that after I made this picture, I felt compelled to write about it. And for me, I think it's important to understand like some of the crossover here between journalism and art. I studied under a man named Stanley Green, who's an amazing photojournalist, and I remember him asking me, are you a journalist or are you an artist? And at the time I was really young, and I just was like, and I was fresh out of journalism school, and I was like, I'm a journalist. But as I got older and thought about it, and I just started to think like, what did that question really mean? And the answer is I'm both. What does that mean? It means that like, it's okay for me to have opinions. It's okay. And it's also okay. And it's okay for me to use a medium to share my opinions on a visceral level that hopefully can can share those emotions with other folks that have had different experiences than me. So, you know, here I wrote down kind of how I felt about the fear and the pain of being dragged into adulthood too quickly as a child, by being put in cuffs and being persecuted as this kid was. And so, you know, I've found that, you know, it's been a really therapeutic experience for me to be able to share my emotions, my pain, my experiences through the arts, but in a journalistic manner, because I do rely on ethics and truth telling first and foremost. But to be able to then use mediums of art to get these feelings across has been a really powerful thing for me. And I've found that now I can reach out through the arts, through visual storytelling in particular. I can reach out to people that just I couldn't reach out to in any other way. Why? Because I can focus on our common humanity. I can focus on our shared experiences. I can focus on what are our common loves and fears, and I can focus on that with my camera, as opposed to focusing on the typical images that we would see around criminal justice in the media. And I can then hopefully reach folks that in a way that hits them emotionally, and maybe they think about things in a different way. This was an image that, to me, I still get upset when I see it. I mean, and I hope I always get upset when I see it. Why do I get pained when I see it? Because I remember being a little kid and having police harass my family. And that's just the first thing I think of right when I see it. And then how that affects you forever. And I have some of the only memories I have from when I was 2 and 3 years old are interactions with police. I mean, like, other than that, I remember emotions and little things, as we all forget stuff from when we're young. But I can remember the times that we were harassed by the police when I was that age, which is just incredible. And so when I started to see, I mean, I was almost crying when I shot this photo, like I couldn't deal with it. And so, I think, but that is kind of what I hope is the power of the arts and of visual mediums, and is to kind of share these things with folks so that they can feel some of that as well. This is an image, actually, something that became important to me is finding visual parallels with history, especially when it comes to criminal justice. This picture is from that camp that I was speaking about in the foothills of the Tahoe foothills in California. So, these young guys who I just totally related with. I mean, when I first got to this place, it was funny because the guards were at first very protective of me. And then within minutes, I was just friends with all these guys, because we had very common backgrounds. And then the guards let me go. And I will say, a lot of the staff at this place, something interesting is, many of the staff that I met understand the inequality going on here, and they kind of were some of them were very happy that I was there to take pictures and to tell stories. And this is these guys actually lining up to go out to work, and it's important to understand how this type of system has been rebranded, right? I mean, you literally have, as I started to study the backstory on this particular camp, and I had no idea about this going in, for the record. I literally was there to photograph inmate firefighters, but then I got so into it because I just made really tight connections with a lot of these guys as friends. And I look back at the history of where this camp came from, and you could draw a direct line to slavery. We're not talking a dotted checkered line. We're talking a straight through line. It began, we went slavery, then we started incarcerating folks and putting them on chain gangs so that they could labor for the state, because that was the new branding at the time. And then actually those chain gangs built roads that came out west and eventually ended in the Tahoe foothills where I was. And then they had to build camps because they had to house all these guys, right? And so they had these guys building the most dangerous roads in the state. And then eventually, same camps it became politically untenable to, you know, call it like a labor camp. So they actually came up with the bright idea of these inmate firefighting crews. So these guys do fight fires, and it's actually something that a lot of these guys, they do enjoy that part of it because that work is rewarding. And so I was there to photograph that, but then I found out, well, what do you do the rest of the time? Well, they still do the same road work, you know, like, so it's kind of like, but it's been a very effective rebranding. They do tons of work for the state. They save millions of dollars for the state, and thereby incentivizes prison labor because you have these guys saving millions. And you know, let me say also that there is still just a stark racial divide here. You know, as being someone who has worked on non-inmate fire camps, or fire crews, excuse me, you see, you know, and then seeing the crews side by side. So you go on a fire, 40% of the guys fighting any wildland fire in California are inmates, for the record. You don't see them in the news, but it's 40%. Okay. So, but you see the crews next to each other, and you see the most of the like Cal State guys are there. It's mostly like a pretty white crew usually. And then you have the all people of color inmate crew, like always, you know, like, I mean, you know, it's all Black and Latino. Like there's a couple white boys, but also what's funny is what will end up happening is they'll put the white inmates in charge of the rest of the crew. And this is just what I've seen firsthand. And I mean, like, and you know, they will tell you this stuff. I mean, it's these weird, strange racial ideas that just like permeate the whole system. So you know, these things still exist. They're very real. They've been rebranded, and we have to kind of show them for what they are if we're going to, and be honest about it.
Right. I think when you understand the kind of economic incentives that help to fuel and sustain the prison system, you do understand why it's been so hard to disrupt it, given all the economic incentives. Norris has a lot to say about economic incentives, as well as a whole host of other things on these topics. So Norris, let's bring you into the conversation. Anything you want to amend or add to what we have said so far? And then please, if you would just share your story, your work, perhaps a little bit about how art and your advocacy have come together at times. And you know, I know you're deeply involved in some electoral campaigns. Please.
Yeah, I think I want to kind of like just pick up on the last thing that Brian said. I was listening at Brian, and most of the time when people hear these stories about inmate labor and stuff like that, people think about the Deep South, not thinking that a state as progressive as California has been, and it's more deadly there because you're talking about firefighting, you know, that's a kind of like dangerous thing in and of itself. But when you think about that, and then the backside of it, that once these kids or these individuals get out, they can't even get a job doing the very same thing that they've been doing for the whole time of their incarceration, you know? And so kind of like just following up on me, you know, I think the introduction you gave was apropos, you know. Sometimes when people talk about me, I got to kind of like look over my shoulder, kind of like figure out who they're talking about. You know? But it was funny because I kind of like got kind of warm when you started talking about how we initially first met. And I tell people all the time about that hospice program. That hospice program, first of all, you had to have the backdrop of that place. This place at one time was the bloodiest prison in America. And it was known for its brutality more so than anything else. So you fast forward a decade, and then you have a program being introduced that, hey, it's kind of funny when I say this, because when we were being introduced to the program itself, I was saying, oh, that's something we already doing. I didn't know they have a formal name for it. I mean, we always, but the system was set up whereas you couldn't visit anybody in the hospital, but for like 15 minutes. And that was it. So you had been in prison with some folks 15, 20, 25 years. They got ill. If they allowed you to visit them at all, it would be for 15 minutes. And we just kind of like just found something really hard about that, you know, because people really started more of self-care because of fear of going to the hospital. And it's almost put us in this time where we are now. When you went to the hospital, nobody could come see you. And so it's almost like people who are infected with COVID-19, they go to the hospital, they're isolated from friends and family. But what that program taught me more than anything else was about man's humanity for other men. And I can share a story with one of my friends, a guy I've been knowing since we were like 12, 13 years old, got sick, was in the hospital. I went to visit him. And by me being a volunteer, we had kind of like carte blanche to visit the hospital and patients. And I asked him, I said, had the orderly been around to give you your bath yet? And he said, no. I said, okay, well, I'll give you your bath. And then the look on his face that here's a man saying he's willing to give you a bath, which was kind of like taboo inside of all males prison, that it taught me then that these are the barriers that we break down. We were blessed that it was documented, that OSF documented, and it actually humanized us. And it began to open the door for us to start presenting ourselves in a different way. That documentary, the documentary The Farm, kind of like shined the light on what was going on behind those fences. And I would tell people all the time, people who would visit and would say, man, this is a massive place. I'm saying, yeah, don't let it deceive you. Those fences are not to keep us in, they're to keep y'all out. Because they don't want people to come in to see the human side of they don't want this narrative to change. The opening scene of The Farm shows where the guys are getting off the bus, they're talking to a correctional officer, and the lady mentions every Monday when this bus shows up, this is job security. And so that became that stark reality for us, is that this is bigger than what people are charged with being here. This is turned into a growth industry. And so that's how we have to see it. Everything that Brian talked about the economic size of it, folks worked in the prison at the minimum with 4 cents an hour, which they took 2 cents to save in a savings account that took you, I would venture to say, almost 5 or 10 years just to get probably $100 in it, if that. And the vast majority of the people who actually in Angola are serving life sentences, of which I had, are practical life, where we mean that 20 flat years or more. And so being in a state where situations like that, we started to realize that we can do one of two things. When these prisons across the country were exploding, we made a conscious decision. We can either change our conditions or change our circumstance. And so we chose the latter. And we started to collectively work together. I worked in the prison law library as a librarian. And we started recruiting other guys with, good legal minds, but at the same time, guys who were other leaders inside the prison. Because one of the things, and people, it's kind of funny when people talk about organizing outside. Organizing inside is tough, So when people ask me about organizing, I say, I never had organizing one-on-one. We just did it by hook or crook, Something happened, we just rallied around whatever it was and tried to make something happen. But what came out of that was this sense of, man, we can do something. We can really change this narrative around what is going on with us. We created an organization that became the political arm inside the prison, Bengal Special Civics Project, which is actually the progeny for VOTE. And we actually started filing legislation. We were successful in the early 90s with getting a parole bill passed that created parole eligibility for everybody in the prison, but lifers. But the lesson learned from that was that sometimes being on the cutting edge of change, you don't benefit from the change you bring about, you know? And so we created this change, but none of the lifers inside the prison were able to benefit from it. Fast forward 30 years, 2017, we were able to get that legislation passed to create parole eligibility for those lifers. And so some of those things along the way, all those journeys along the way, and I tell people, I think the most for me, because I've had a lot of internal and external successes, but I think that hospice program really set the tempo in a sense because it showed people what our potential really was. To be in an environment where every day you're thinking about, will I have to hurt somebody today or will I be hurt today? To an environment where all we wanted to do was take care of each other, you know, because we realized in that moment, all we had was each other. And so I think moving forward with that, it kind of like created this thing. And, you know, the story you told about when you saw those folks on horseback, well, that's still alive today. This is 2020 America. And so the more things changed, you know, the more they stay the same. And it's for no other reason but that indelible impression that this is a prison farm, and on this prison farm, you work. And although there's, you know, all the machinery that the local farmer will envy to plant crops and harvest crops, that they prefer to use that 6,000 men manpower that they have to harvest the crops. And I would always question during inclement weather when we didn't have to work in the field, who is tending the crops? And then you would see somebody out there driving the tractors, harvesting, the indication that was no need for us to be out there. But I'm excited that in this moment, that it gives us a chance to highlight all those flaws. You know, this COVID pandemic has gave us an opportunity to, one, push back at these physical plants that's being built, that we can say, wait a minute, you got to take into account now social distancing that don't exist, that never existed. So if you're thinking about building something, you have to build with this in mind. And so I think it gives us this opportunity. To be frank, I was saddened by the fact that folks had to take to the streets, but I'm overly excited by the fact that we have, because I think this is the time. This is that time that we've been waiting for, that moment that we're saying something is going to happen. We just can't put our finger on what it is. Sadly, it was the life of George Floyd, but I think that became the straw that broke the camel's back, that everybody started to say in unison, the emperor has no clothes on. Look at him. And now we're starting to see. And when we see, the thing I think I was really more excited about anything watching the protests was the fact that when I started seeing folks in Utah and folks in Idaho, and I'm like, whoa, ain't no black folks over there, you know? Only black folks over there are athletes, you know, ain't but a handful of them. And so it kind of like tells me that the consciousness of the people in this country is starting to wake up. And that's really, really, really refreshing that we can have these kind of conversations, you know? Just for a side of humor, you know, one of the things I wanted to say when we first got on, normally when folks introduce gatherings or sessions, the first thing they say, we're going to do a little housekeeping. We don't have to do housekeeping now because everybody's at home.
At home. Yes, we're barely keeping our own houses, right? So given the fact that, and we've got lots of activity in the chat, and we want to make sure that we can leave time for questions and answers, I'm wondering if I can ask the two of you just to speak to what's your greatest hope for this moment? Like, what does true transformational justice, what does that look like? What does that mean for both of you? And then I think something that we're also on the flip side of kind of our optimism, it's like, what's your greatest worry about missing this moment? And what can we do to ensure that this window of opportunity doesn't close before we're able to push forward on true transformational justice and change?
I'll go, Brian, and let you clean up. I think the hope that I see is that from this there is policy reform, real policy reform, and not just for policy reform, but if folks don't want to change policies, we need to change people. And I think this is this opportunity for us to see it, and we're seeing it happen right in front of our faces, where in Minnesota, the city council took the initiative to say, we're going to reallocate the resources that we've been putting into policing. 20 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. 10 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. 5 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. But it's in this moment that it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I fear is that we miss the mark.
Right.
That we let somebody steal the narrative from us, because as we are saying the hashtag, which is, a cool hashtag, defund the police, people are trying to put a spin on that about, crime is going up because people are lawless in the street. And I think we need to recapture that phrase and explain to folks, when we saying defund the police, we mean we need to reallocate those dollars. We need to take that money that we are putting into those ninja suits that they're wearing, those tanks they're rolling out with, and we need to put it, we wouldn't be having this conversation now about opening up schools for kids to go back to and where the money gonna come from, because that money will already be in place. Those kids will have all the things that they need to have a bright future. So my whole thing is whether or not, the hope is that we're making these policy decisions right now. And the only fear or misgiving is that we don't have the power to sustain ourselves, that we're not willing to fight one day longer than them, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take our commitment to fight one day longer than the opposition is willing to stand.
You're worried about our fatigue.
Yes.
Yeah. Brian, how do you want to take on this two-headed question?
Well, first of all, I think on the positive side, I'd start there. I think that there's been a fundamental change in dialogue. Just as one example, the fact that I can comfortably speak about my past with the criminal justice system. I could go back 5 years ago, I wouldn't have done that, maybe less, because I would have felt like I was going to get tarred and feathered at that point. It's something I would not put in my bio. You know what I mean? This is something that that I was horrified about and I didn't want anybody to know about. But now I feel like it's important to share. And I think that I can share that. The fact that I can even share that openly is a huge societal fundamental shift, right? So I think that is really positive. We need to listen to people and their different experiences with the society that we live in. And as far as listening, that's the other positive thing that I'm experiencing firsthand. I have colleagues that maybe tilt more conservative. They've had a different experience in this society than I have. And I've found many of them listening, which is something that, whereas it doesn't have to be I find them being quiet and listening to my opinion when we have discussions about these things, that maybe that wasn't happening only a few months back. And I think that is just huge. So those are some of the positives that I think are real and tangible. And then I have fears. I have several fears. I won't get into all of them, but my immediate tangible fear is for one thing, I see the economic disparities growing at a very rapid clip. And I think that is what's behind a lot of problems in our society in general. And I see that getting worse, not better right now. And then I also it's always very difficult, for instance, just as an example, to work inside of any facility. The vast majority of the work I do is just trying to get access and get access to these folks that are are totally, you know, I'm being kept out by those fences that Norris is talking about at all times. Well, I could see the COVID situation being used as a tool to just completely keep me away from these folks that I'm accustomed to working with, because, you know, it can now be just said, like, it's too dangerous for you to come in. And I really find that there's no substitute for working in person, especially with folks that are accustomed to a different form of learning. And so, you know, I'm really scared that, and I don't know how long that's going to last. So yeah, I'm scared that those are kind of some of my fears currently.
Thank you both for sharing all of that. And I guess I'm wondering, just on your last point, Brian, and we will open up to questions and answers next, but if you could think, and maybe we'll come back at the very end, like, what are some things that we would ask of this audience to join as allies and champions for justice? Like, what are the things that people on this call can be doing kind of in the immediate and in the long term to ensure that some of the positives that we spoke of have the chance to manifest and grow, and some of the things that we worry and fear about, fatigue and missing the moment, that doesn't come to pass? So you guys can think about it, and I'm going to turn to the chat here and see if we can pull up. There are lots of questions. If anybody on the Pulitzer wants to highlight one or two that we think can get us going. Okay, let's see. Here's one. A few people have questions about career tracks in prison. Are the people incarcerated given the same equipment and training as a civilian firefighter? So this is to you, Brian. If so, why can't the incarcerated people become firefighters after they're released? Are there accredited programs?
So they are given, I would say, equivalent training and equipment. And that's, but when they get, there's been a lot of pushback to allowing any of these guys to become, excuse me, my dogs are getting a little bit here, apologies. There's actually been pushback from the firefighters unions themselves against having any of these guys be allowed to become firemen. There's been more leeway when it comes to juveniles that get out and have the training, allowing for them to wipe their records and use this training to then go into these fields. But the majority of the guys that I have worked with while they were incarcerated have not been able to access those jobs when they get out. The firefighters unions, I don't really know what their real problem is. When they're on the fire line, these guys will tell you that the inmate firefighters are the baddest dudes they know. I mean, like, these guys are tough as nails and they rely on them for their safety, like when they're out there. And yet when they are released, all of a sudden there's this pushback to them being able to make a good living out there with these jobs. So, I mean, I don't understand it personally, but yeah, you cannot become a firefighter when you get out because because of your record at that point. You're not allowed. It's a real barrier to you getting employed.
That's great. There is another. Thank you. There's another question for Brian, and that is: did Mr. Frank stay in touch with any of the youths he photographed at the camp? Where did he publish the initial images?
So I'm in touch with a lot of guys. Some of them, you know, I get letters all the time, and I reach back and I reach out, and some of the guys I've followed up with and photographed their returns home. Some of the guys, unfortunately, have gotten locked back up. Most people end up getting locked back up due to probation violations, et cetera, which is a whole nother discussion. This the reason the majority of people go back to prison in this country is for technical violations, not for new crimes. So a lot of these guys, and I end up being an advocate for a lot of them in court. I write letters to the court, et cetera. And yeah, and stay in touch with their families, et cetera. Because I become friends with a lot of these guys. There's just, I feel a kinship with a lot of them, and I know that I could have easily been them, and and by some fortune, I was able to escape the trap. And so we become really tight. And yeah, and Yes, several of them I'm in touch with all the time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Question for Norris. Let's see. Peggy would like to hear your opinion on the struggle to give parolees and formerly incarcerated individuals, the right to vote. It's not beyond unthinkable that coming out of prison, they don't have the right of, it's just beyond unthinkable that people coming home don't have the right of full citizenship. So yes, all around.
Well, I've been an advocate for voting rights for almost 40 years. I actually started inside when I was actually doing some research and realized that our Constitution, we had just changed our Constitution in 1974, and it didn't prohibit formerly incarcerated people from having the right to vote. The challenge was that most folks outside believed that once a person went to prison, they actually lost their right to vote, which is true in a lot of states. I think in 2000, Bush v. Gore kind of like peeled the onion back on the impact of felon disenfranchisement. And so I've been kind of like beating that drum ever since. We were instrumental in the campaign in Florida with Amendment 4. The very same year we had got the right restored to people on probation and parole here in Louisiana. But yeah, that's the drum beat that I march by, you know. It's trying, because there's no correlation between a person going to prison and losing his right to vote. There's no statute in any state that once you get sentenced by a judge that say, oh, and by the way, I'm sentencing you to use your right to vote. That's just a collateral consequence from Jim Crow that, the Jim Crow era realized that if we took the right to vote away from people of color, which were Afro-American at that time, that we can, rule with an iron fist. And that's what they've done for the last 100 years. And it's now in light of the George Floyd, because this is the George Floyd moment, that a lot of people are starting to revisit that. If you look at Mississippi then got rid of the Confederate flag. They're looking at all the Jim Crow policies that impacted felon disenfranchisement. And so, that's very important, but not just the fact that registering, but getting people to actually participate. I'm kind of like proud to say that in the last 17 years that I've been home, and even before I came home, we were helping elect people from behind the walls. And but since I've been home, I've helped elect 2 governors, a mayor, and umpteen judges. But because people who are closest to those problems, that much closer to the solution, we understand the impact that these positions or offices have on people's lives. We've watched the impact from a distance. And now we're not bystanders now, we're participants. And so it's easy for us to push the envelope in that direction.
Mm. Norris, can you say a little bit about the ways in which formerly incarcerated leaders are organizing in networks across the country and how voter engagement, voter registration is at its core? So FICPFM, a little bit about the structure and maybe some of the plans that are in the works for this November.
Right. That network, FICPFM, is formerly incarcerated convicted people's family movement. And it's a core group of us who got together. We are from California, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, New York, Carolina. And we kind of like came together and realized that, hey, man, we all doing the same work across this country. Let's kind of like collectivize the work that we're doing to pull something together. And so we formally, in 2011, created FICPFM. We've had several national gatherings. Every odd year we do regional gatherings to educate organizations that are led and directed by direct impacted leadership. And so building off of what we've been able to do here in Louisiana, what we've done in Florida, what we've done in Alabama, in that election with Doug Jones, Kenny and them being a part of that. We're gearing up now. We're working with Darcy and them in California now about AB 6, trying to restore the right to vote to people on parole. And so we are waking up this sleeping giant across this country because, not only are we 2 million people inside, we're the families of those 2 million people that inside. And, we have this inside outside strategy, whereas, we still connected to our folks inside. And when it comes this time of the year, election season, we just, on the phone with our folks, educating them to educate their family and friends about what they need to do. So we, COVID-19 put some water on us too, because we were planning our national gathering to butt up against the conventions of the two parties and to kind of like move the needle in that direction in the sense of what we want, what's the expectation for us. Everybody is talking about what they're doing or what they're planning to do, but we have a wish list of what, and these are not requests. These are demands that we're making on folks because, we're tired of going to people with hat in hand because one, we understand now the power that we actually have within our hands at the ballot box. And just like what Brian was saying about, he stays in touch with those young men have become their friends. And the other thing is that they follow his leadership. And I think one of the things that we've been able to build across this country and our network is the kind of credibility that we need to move a mass movement of people. My biggest push to people now is that if we have kind of like threw caution to the wind around COVID-19 and we're in the streets, we have to show up this very same way in November. We have to be, because our life is on the line right now. This is a life and death moment for us in this country, and we have to see it that way. And the way we change that is going out and selecting people who's going to do our bidding for us, more none.
Norris, you're leaving us in a very good spot. I want to see if maybe Brian wants to add anything. If people want to get involved, in addition to the elections and some of the work that Norris is highlighting, but if people want to get involved in their local communities to support your efforts, to work with young people, to engage. Recommendations, good organizations to connect them to?
Yeah, I have found the way that I've been able to really tangibly get into the community and help folks directly has been through local universities, actually. There's programs that, for instance, my brother-in-law runs a program, for formerly incarcerated students that are trying to get into university. And like, for me, that was how, I took my first journalism class while I was living in a work furlough program, and it changed my life. You know what I mean? So like, I have found those higher education institutions to be just like totally integral and like, and in those places, there are support networks for folks that are getting out and like, and really need basic fundamental help. It could just be like a bus pass to get to like school. like little stuff that we don't even think about. So, there's at my local university, it was a program called Project Rebound. And they literally are just there to like kind of to bridge that gap and help some of these guys and girls like to get into, to find these opportunities and expand their minds, which is like really the key. As folks get educated, they really start to understand the system and their place in it and how they've been being exploited by it for their whole lives. And it just can like open up all types of opportunities. So, I encourage people to kind of be helpful in those areas. That's where I've had the most success.
That's great. And I think as we wrap and as I hand it back to Anne, just want to encourage everybody on the audience, if there were things that you want to know more about, if there are ways in which you'd like to plug in and want, in addition to the organizations that were highlighted here, more leads, this is the time. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of energy. We got to make the most of this moment, and we need everybody. So Norris, Brian, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I am turning it back to Anne.
Thank you so much. And it's just been a pleasure to have this conversation. I know it went by way too fast. And we thank our audience as well for the many terrific and important questions they shared with us. We know we didn't get to all of them, and we are aiming to answer some more of your questions when we post the video online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days. And we'll also hopefully add some resources there as well, because I know there's a lot that folks want to take away from this. We want to thank our colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, Holly Peipenberg, our producer for this session, and of course, our Pulitzer Center reporting and education outreach on mass incarceration and related justice issues are supported by the Art for Justice Fund, which we're grateful for, and our other donors. The Art for Justice Fund was created by Agnes Gunn in partnership with Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Remember to stay just a few more minutes with us. I know we're a bit over time, but we do have a brief survey that we'd like you to take advantage of, and to know that we are a nonprofit journalism organization. And if you can find the ability to support us, we would be most appreciative. Our next session in the Focus on Justice series is set for next week, Thursday, July 16th at 2 p.m. And it will focus in on reporting by Frank Carlson of PBS NewsHour and his Broken Justice series, which followed the story of Ricky Kidd and others who suffered under Missouri's public defender system. Along with Frank, we'll also have Ricky, who spent 23 years behind bars in Missouri after being wrongfully convicted of a double homicide. And we'll also have Alec Karakatsanis, who's the founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Corps, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting systemic injustice in American law. So a lot of that conversation will also be about the systemic racism, as well as public defender system and bail bond reforms. So please join us next week and share this onward with your friends and colleagues. And once again, thanks to our speakers and our audience for this really wonderful and important conversation today. And have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again.